Hi, I'm going to talk to you about regression testing using the PumpCX platform. Regression testing is when we execute a large number of test cases over an environment, attempting to prove that the entire environment is operational. You'll often perform regression tests during development and during release cycles, and again during general operation. For instance, after a developer has finished a feature, they'll often want to attempt to prove that the changes have not broken any other functionality with the environment. Traditionally, within telephony environments, when we've attempted to regression test, a developer will work on a section, test that quite thoroughly, and then try and think what other parts of the environment they might have broken and test those, and perhaps do a few test calls throughout the rest of the environment and decree that the testing was successful. Then potentially a group of testers will sit down and run through regression test plans for the environment. However, to adequately test an entire environment requires placing a huge number of calls, and it's often not economically viable to execute the entire test flow. And furthermore, when you're making 200 or 300 or 1,000 calls to completely test environment and you have one failure, it's often quite easy to convince yourself as the tester that you personally must have done something wrong. Every other time you've dialed this number, it's worked and you've entered the account number and it's come back with the correct value. Just this time when you did it, it didn't work. You convince yourself, well, maybe I pressed the wrong button, maybe I didn't wait long enough, maybe something else was at fault. Repeat the test case a few times, it works, and convince yourself there's no problem. The issue with this is it lets problems with a low cardinality occur and slip through the testing. So if there is a test flow that once every 200 or 300 times, you call it, fails, you don't normally pick this up in non-automated testing. But when you're using a tool like Pump, it's great. Every call you have, there are complete logs, there are network traces, there's a recording, and there's no ability to wiggle out of a problem. If there's a failure, we've got the IDs of the system, we've got logs, we've got the call logs. You can't say, I did the wrong thing, because every time we execute it, it's the same thing. So a lot of these low-level faults don't slip through in the first place. And secondly, because the tests are automated and they can be run in parallel, you can do the testing really quickly. And the great thing about this, and without any significant cost to execute, so the great thing about this is you can actually run your regression test a lot more often. Anyway, so once we get into Pump and how do we create test and execute test regression suites in Pump, well, this is a question of creating a set of test cases which completely describe and check the behaviour of a system. So for instance, for a very simple IVR, such as the IVR created in the Genesis demonstration environment, there's an IVR loaded on route point 8011. And we started to think, well, what would be the normal test cases you would expect to be able to dial, you'd expect to be able to run on this very simple IVR where you enter an account number, a password, and then a menu. So we came up with quickly around 15 test cases, which we thought were really good. And so we wrote test cases for these, which were very quick to write. And another thing about these test cases, often when you're writing regression test suites, you can write test cases which incrementally grow. So our very first test case might be just that we dialed 8011 and it answered. And then the next test case maybe we dialed 8011 and it answered and it played the first prompt. So then we can very quickly see by where the tests started failing exactly which part of the call flow is failing. As opposed to one big bang test case which you dial the number, hear the right prompt, you enter the password, wait a while, hear the next prompt, enter the password, wait a while, hear the next prompt, wait a while, press 2, and we saw the correct attached data. That's great in that you can get a lot of the best case call flow where everything worked through in one test case, but when it fails, without diving into the test case, it's really hard to understand which part failed, when, as a regression test, making the extra calls is no extra effort. So it's good to incrementally increase the level of testing in each test case so we can see quickly where the failures occurred. So in this case, we knocked together 15 test cases, and we expected these to all pass bar one. We knew that our route point wasn't externally dialable at the moment. That number's not hooked up. So we expected that to fail. But all of the other test cases, we actually expected to pass. So we created these test cases, and we were going through, and so we expected to be able to come in, the count number was requested. We expected that if we entered nothing, that it would repeat. However, you'll see when we execute this that we actually discovered that there was actually no error checking whatsoever in this application. And if we entered no input or we entered invalid account numbers, then the application just continued quite merrily on. Anyway, so let's, as per any test that you want to execute within Pump, we created our test cases. We then need to bind them into a test set for execution. So that's pretty straightforward. We have a regression folder. Within that we have one test set labelled after the part of functionality we're testing, which in this case was IVR 8011. And we selected our 15 test cases. It's all very standard. Then what we want to do when we execute this regression test. If we were only executing it ad hoc, so if we were going to do a change, we wanted to execute it now, that was quite simple. We could create the test set and then just click on this execute once button. So let's do this. Do we want to execute this once now? Bang, and it's running. We see that diving off, starting to dial calls. Now there's a limit, it's configured to dial a maximum of 10 concurrent calls with 1 call per second. We know that there's 15 calls in the environment, in the test set. So I dialed the first 10. We still see there's, okay, now it's, as early ones finished, subsequent test cases have failed, and we're going through, we've still got 6, we've completed 6, and we've still got 9 in process. And this will continue until we get to the end. We can already see that some have passed, 1 has failed, now 3 have failed, 1's still active, and 11 are passed. Okay, we're complete now. 12 passed, 3 failed. So let's drill down into what does that look like. Okay, just before we drill down, we'll actually see that that actually raised an alarm on the platform because we had a failed test case in a functional test set. Okay, so let's open that up and see what does it look like. We can immediately see which test case has passed and which one's failed. So we expect this one to fail. There is no external number hooked up pointing to it. It gives busy if we dial at the moment, so we expected that to fail, and the call was not answered. So that's as per expectation. Okay, we can then look down at some of the other ones that failed. These were the ones which we speak about, where there is no input and there was no reprompting done on the test case. So we expected after the initial account number was played that that menu would have been repeated. It wasn't, and we failed those test cases. Okay. Also with regression test sets, a lot of customers actually choose to additionally create these as a scheduled test set. Why would you want to do this? Well, especially if numbers aren't 24/7 numbers, many organisations choose to run a regression test some hours before the contact centre is due to come online. So if most of the traffic starts at 8 o'clock in the morning, some contact centres will elect to run a regression suite at around 6 a.m. The good thing about running it a couple of hours beforehand is it's close enough to the start of day that if you had any problems that occurred overnight, you would know that they would actually be happening by 6 a.m. Any scheduled work should have finished well and truly, and by 6 a.m. the environment should be up and running, ready for the day. So it's late enough that any planned activities should have finished, yet it's early enough that if you run a regression test and discover you have some problems, your engineers have time to be notified there's an issue and work on resolving it before traffic starts to build up at 8 or 9 o'clock, depending on your profile of your business. So in order to schedule a test case, that's very simple. We can come down to the execution schedule, select which days we want to execute it, what time, and what time we want it to execute. So if we wanted to change this so it executed each business day at 6 a.m, we could put in days a week, Monday to Friday, run at 6 a.m, repeat. We don't want to repeat, we only want to run it once. We can put in the initial sessions, 10, and the initial number of calls per second of 1. At that point, this test case will now run each morning and alarm if there's any problems.